Well, I'm glad to preach Acts 2:14 through 36 this morning. Excited to do that with you guys. And it's an exciting morning because I believe God is moving in our church family. I believe God is moving in our church family in a way that I have not seen in my 7 years here as your pastor. We are seeing more people come to Christ, more people share their faith, more stories of people being moved to step out of their comfort zone and engage their workplace with the gospel than we ever have before. And I just want to say that this is an amazing time to invite somebody to church, to invite a friend, to invite a coworker, to invite somebody to say, hey, come see what God is doing in my church family. This is an amazing season to join the Winds of the Spirit's movement in your workplace and engage in that spiritual conversation or gospel conversation. This is an amazing season to pray for those ones represented on these boards that you're praying for to come to Christ, that we can see them in these waters of baptism this very year. I believe there are people you are praying for this year we're gonna get to see enter the waters of baptism. Be faithful to pray for those folks. One of the reasons I wanna mention that as we start is I believe what we're experiencing now is rooted in what we saw last week in Acts chapter 2. We saw the birth of the church as the Spirit descended and dwelt in these believers and empowered them. That same indwelling presence and empowering work of the Spirit is what's moving our church today. Acts is the historical account of the ascended Jesus birthing, refining, and sending the church. And it's an invitation for you and I to continue to participate in that incredible work. What we're gonna hear this morning is Peter's sermon explaining the significance of the arrival of the Spirit. Acts 2, that first part of that passage ends with confusion. The people have heard the gospel in different languages. Some are confused, some are even accusing them of drunkenness. And Peter rises to preach a message and says, no, you've misunderstood the significance of this. You can sum up Peter's explanation of the significance of Pentecost with one word, and that word is accountability. What Peter's saying is the Spirit's arrival means there's a heightened accountability all of us need to understand we have before God. Now, accountability simply is being responsible for your decisions, a willingness to be held account for what you've done. There's a lot of resistance to accountability in our current cultural moment. We'll hear politicians say things like mistakes were made, trying to distance themselves from their own responsibility and their own culpability. My favorite moment where somebody was resistant to accountability was Allen Iverson. You guys remember this moment where he didn't want to show up to practice? And he has this 5-minute tirade saying, we're talking about practice, man. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can Google that because it's obvious that you don't know how funny that really is. It's hilarious. Go Google it, check it out on YouTube. It's amazing. We have this resistance to accountability in our lives. We don't want to be told what to do. But here's what I want you to see this morning. All of you, every single one of us in this room are being held accountable to something. Every one of us in this room are living with a sense of accountability to something in our lives. There's something or someone we're trying to please. For some of us, that's just ourselves. You've adopted the be true to yourself mentality, and that's what you're trying to be accountable to. Others of us, it's other people. You're constantly trying to figure out how to keep everybody happy in your life, and you're trying to please them and calibrate your life so that everybody likes you. And there's an accountability you live enslaved to others. So others of us, it might be society. We want to be on the right side of history, and we're constantly trying to size up which way the cultural winds are blowing so that we are accountable in the right kind of way. What I want you to know is the only way you can live with real freedom and real peace in your life is if you know who you really are accountable to and how you're meant to respond to that accountability in your life. That's right. Those two questions are what Acts 2:14 through 36 are going to answer. It starts, and I want you to write this down, with the Spirit's demonstration of judgment. If you're taking notes, I want you to write that down. Peter starts this sermon by showing us how the Spirit demonstrates the judgment of God. So Peter indeed does say, hey, these people aren't drunk. Let me explain. He's with the 11, he's preaching, and he cites Joel 2 to say what we're seeing is actually the fulfillment of promise. What we're observing in Pentecost and the Spirit descending and the people speaking the gospel in different languages It's the result of promise. Look at how he talks about this promise in verse 17. Verse 17 of chapter 2 says, and it will be in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my spirit on all people. Then your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. I will even pour out my spirit on my servants in those days, both men and women, and they will prophesy. There are things that Joel promised that Pentecost fulfilled. God has given his spirit to live within believers, not based on their ethnicity, not based on their gender or socioeconomic status. Joel promised that God would pour out his spirit on his people, and it's exactly what happens in Acts 2. God pours out his spirit to live within and empower all those who trust Jesus. It's just a good reminder from last week to say, every single follower of Jesus, if you know Jesus today, you have the Spirit of God living within you, empowering your life. Amen. Now, what's cool about this is he's saying from Joel 2 that the promise that was made almost 1,000 years ago, there's a 1,000-year gap between Joel 2 and Acts 2. And he's saying that has come to fruition in your life. But it's not just that what we've seen in Pentecost is the fulfillment of promise. There's also a sense in which what we see in Pentecost is pointing us forward to the future. So often, biblical prophecy in the Old Testament has layers to it. There's a New Testament layer that you see fulfilled, for example, in Acts 2. But there's something in the background that's yet to come to pass. Look at the rest of chapter 2, verses 19 through 21, and listen how he describes what's coming in the future. I will display wonders in the heavens above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and a cloud of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and glorious day of the Lord comes. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So 17 through 18, that's Pentecost. That's happened. 19 through 21 is speaking to the future return of Jesus and the final judgment of God. These wonders he talks about, blood, fire, cloud of smoke, that's some of the exact same language John uses in the book of Revelation to describe the end. We also know that this last section is dealing with the future because we see this phrase in verse 20, that is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is an Old Testament category for this final judgment of God, a kind of outpouring of God's judgment that will destroy evil from the earth once and for all. I had a buddy one time who they found mold in his house. And it was so widespread that they had to strip the house down to the studs and the foundation to get it out. Not a fun experience, right? Stripped it down because it had been so pervasive, so widespread that they had to cleanse that entire house by ripping up the sheetrock, ripping up the carpet, ripping out the HVAC to get it all out. The day of the Lord is God stripping the world down to the studs. It's him cleansing the world. Every single direction sin has gone, God is going to purify and destroy once and for all. Peter, what he's doing then is he's saying, look, I want you to understand that because the Spirit's come, you're living in days leading up to the judgment of God. That's right. This is why he said in verse 17, look at the text again. And it will be in the last days, says God. Some of your translations will bolden the words, and it will be, and then unbolden the words, in the last days. That is because Peter is giving commentary to Joel 2. He's explaining that Joel 2 is not just meant to be understood as fulfillment of promise. It's meant to shift how we think about time itself. An NFL quarterback, in addition to reading the defense and calling the plays, has to keep one eye on the play clock. If that play clock goes to the bottom, it gets to 0, and they've not hiked the ball, there's a penalty. What Peter's doing is he's calling us to keep one eye on the spiritual play clock. You need to know when you're living. You are living, now that the Spirit has come, in a time in which the next major thing God is going to do in the world is judgment. In so doing, here's what Peter tells us, and this is what's important for your life. The Spirit's indwelling demonstrates God is judge. Write that down if you're taking notes. What this text is telling us in this first half is that because the Spirit has come, God is the final judge. See, they were misunderstanding why the Spirit was there. They were confused. Some of them even thought it was drunkenness. Peter says, no, these people aren't drunk. This is not just some random occurrence. This is a move of God that demonstrates, that shows us that ultimately every single one of us are accountable to God. One of the ways to think about the accountability of God is to think about God as creator. If I, in my garage, make something, which, by the way, that's the sign that I'm being held hostage, because I would never do that. You want to know if I'm being held hostage? Is he woodworking in his garage? Okay, he's under the gun there. But if I did do that, and I made something, what rights do I have over what I make? Total. I have exclusive, total rights, total authority over what I make. If I want to change it, if I want to break it, if I want to start over, it's mine to do with as I please. Part of what we recognize about the judgment of God is the reason he's judge is because he made you. He made us. And one of the greatest mistakes you can make in your life is to misunderstand who you're really accountable to. You're not accountable to yourself. Doesn't matter how strong your feelings are. The moral insanity we see unleashed in our culture today is at its root a misunderstanding of who you're accountable to. Transgender movement, gay marriage movement, all of these movements are rooted in this belief that I'm accountable to myself. I've got to be true to myself. Here's the problem. That's half true. God did make you uniquely, wondrously. There's no two of us the same. But your feelings, how you feel about something, is not ultimately what you're accountable to. You're accountable to the one who made you. Heard a preacher say that this is God's universe and God's law. You may have what you think is a better way, but you don't have a universe. God's universe, God's authority. Be careful about buying into this cultural narrative that if I'm just true to myself, if I'm just honest with myself, I just follow my feelings, and if I'm accountable to that, then I'm going to be fine. It's equally important to undercut this idea that I'm accountable to others. Some of you are spending an inordinate amount of energy trying to keep everybody happy in your life. You're a constant chameleon, changing with who you're with, and you're constantly trying to size up how you can calibrate your life to keep everybody on the level. You're not accountable to everybody else. I'm not saying go out and be a jerk. I'm not saying try to push people away from you. But ultimately, you're accountable to God. This passage tells us that we are accountable to a judge, to the Lord, and the accountability that he holds us to is to treat him as such. What it really means to be accountable to the Lord is that every thought, word, and deed are lived in submission to him. Accountability to the Lord means every thought, every word, and every deed honor and obey him. This is an impossible standard none of us can meet. But that's the weight of Acts 2 in the first part of this sermon. Peter's wanting them to see, if you understand the Spirit's come and that God is judge, that means you're accountable to somebody for something you cannot do on your own. You know, the sin of the garden in Adam and Eve when they disobeyed God was they sought to enjoy the blessing of God apart from the authority of God. This is what we do. We want to enjoy this world. We want to enjoy what we have, but we don't want to listen to God's authority. This is why this passage ends. Look back at verse 21 with this. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. We are held accountable to a standard we cannot meet. Peter says from Joel 2, the solution is call on the Lord. Here's the question. Who is the Lord? What he does in the rest of the sermon is he says, let me show you that Jesus Christ is Lord. If you're taking notes, write this down. The second thing we see in this text is the Spirit's revealing of Jesus. See, the Spirit demonstrating that God is judge, but we're about to see how the Spirit reveals who Jesus Christ truly is. Now, when Peter uses this word Lord and goes on to argue that Jesus is this person, this is a massive claim. The word Lord in the Old Testament is one of the most important titles for God. It's our understanding of the word Yahweh. It's the covenant name for God, his personal name. It's the God of promise, but it's also the God of rescue, of deliverance. It's the God that brings the nation of Israel out of bondage and slavery in Egypt. And what he's going to do, he's going to show us 4 dimensions, I'm going to walk through briskly, of the ministry of Jesus that shows us that he's the same Lord that delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt. Number 1, he talks about the life of Jesus. He shows us that Jesus is Lord by talking about his life. Look at verse 22. Fellow Israelites, listen to these words. This Jesus of Nazareth was a man attested to you by God with miracles, wonders, and signs that God did among you through him, just as you yourselves know. The key word in that phrase is that he performed miracles and signs. The miracles of Jesus were not just expressions of power, they were demonstrations that he truly is God. John uses that phrase sign a lot in his gospel, and you see it in the first half where he talks about the raising of Lazarus, the healing of the lame man, the water to wine. All these things were a flashing arrow pointing to Jesus being God. Secondly, he talks about Christ's death. There's the death of Jesus. There's the life of Jesus first, but there's secondly his death. Look at verse 23. Though he was delivered up according to God's determined plan and foreknowledge, you used lawless people to nail him to a cross and kill him. Peter calls out, by the way, very boldly, many of the Jewish people that are listening to this message for being complicit in the death of Jesus. He says, you handed an innocent man over to the Roman authorities and he was killed on a cross. But Peter wants to make it clear that this, while they were complicit in it, while they were blinded by their sin and their anger towards Jesus, it was actually, did you see the first part of 23? It was God's determined plan and foreknowledge to use their sin for his own purposes. Jesus Christ came into the world when Rome was in charge because God had planned in eternity past for Jesus Christ to die on a cross for you and for me. It's not just the death of Jesus. Thirdly, there's the resurrection. There's the life of Jesus, 22, the death of Jesus, 23, but then 24 all the way to 32, he talks about the resurrection of Jesus. Look at verse 24. God raised him up, ending the pains of death because it was not possible for him to be held by death. Jesus could not be held by death any more than a child can be stopped from being birthed when its time has come. That's the metaphor here. It's this inevitability of what's to come that brings Jesus from death to life. We read a moment ago, Psalm 16, where Peter talks about David as a prophet. Listen to verse 29 through 31 as he interprets Psalm 16, not just to be about David, but to be ultimately about Jesus. Brothers and sisters, I can confidently speak to you about the patriarch David. He is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us today. Since he was a prophet, he knew that God had sworn an oath to him to seat one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing what was to come, he spoke concerning the resurrection of the Messiah. He was not abandoned in Hades, and his flesh did not experience decay. God has raised this Jesus. We are all witnesses of this. Peter's saying, look, David was talking about things in his own life. He was talking about his hope in God. But ultimately what David was pointing to is the resurrection of Christ. See, while that Passover lamb died and that blood was put on the doorpost in Egypt and the death angel passed over, Jesus is a lamb who comes back to life. He's the sacrifice who lives in the power of God. He tells us that he's witnesses to this. These apostles are witnessing to this. And then fourthly, verse 33, he talks about the ascension. Look at verse 33 in the ascension. Therefore, since he has been exalted to the right hand of God and has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit, he has poured out what you both see and hear. For it was not David who ascended to the heavens, but he himself says, the Lord declares to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Psalm 110, quoting again David, talking about these two lords. Who are these people? This is referencing the ascension of Jesus, that Jesus went back to the Father, exalted, victorious, overcoming, but also enthroned. Now the one who pours out the Spirit. Here's the point. The life, the death, The resurrection and the ascension of Jesus tell us that he is Lord. Jesus is Lord because he lived a perfect life. He lived the life for you you could not live for yourself. Jesus is Lord because he died in your place. You don't face the judgment of God because Jesus faced that for you. Jesus is your Lord because he rose from the dead, and now he's ascended and able to deliver you and I through the work of the Spirit in our hearts. If you're taking notes, write this down. The Spirit's indwelling reveals Jesus is Lord. The Spirit coming shows us that God is judge, Peter tells us, shows us that we're accountable to him, but he also shows us that Jesus is the only one who can deliver us from the judgment of God. This past summer, my sons and I got to hike down into Bright Angel Trail in the Grand Canyon. How many of you have ever done that in here? Raise your hand if you've ever done Bright Angel and know about that. It's incredibly hot. We went in June, July time, and I made the mistake of saying, let's sleep in today. We'll leave about 10:30. It'll be fine. And that was a mistake. All throughout that trail, though, there are these shade houses you can go into, right? And during the summer, it's packed. There's like 100 people packed in this small little thing because everybody knows under that shade, it's about 20, maybe 30 degrees cooler than it is on that trail. What this passage is telling us is that when you come to accept that Jesus is Lord, you fall under the shade of God's grace. See, when you enter this world, you're out on the trail. You're under the authority and judgment of God, under a standard you cannot meet for yourself. But when you trust him, when you bow the knee to King Jesus, you come under his shade and protection in a profound, supernatural way that changes everything. Amen. The reason you don't face the judgment of God is because Jesus faces that for you. The logic of Acts 2 is simple. Spirit has come, God is judge, you're accountable. The Spirit has come, Jesus is Lord, and the only way you live under this accountability is if you've accepted Jesus as Lord. I want to finish just by talking to especially those of you for a few moments who are believers about the significance of the lordship of Jesus in your life. One of the most important realities about Jesus being Lord in your life is how you respond when you sin. There's some of us that need to remember that the lordship of Jesus, his forgiveness and grace, is not a license to sin. Jesus is not a consultant. Jesus is Lord. You know what a consultant does? They come in, they make suggestions, they point out things that you might need to fix, you hand them some money, and then they leave. And you can decide whether you want to do those things or not, right? There's some of us in this room that I think can adopt a Jesus as consultant mentality with our sins. Well, Spencer, it sounds like you're saying works save me, that I have to do things to be right with God. No, works don't save you. You're not saved by what you do. But we've got to be crystal clear, brothers and sisters, that when we accept Christ, we are saved for good works. We're not saved by good works, but we're saved for a new life that God has for us. It strikes me that today, it's easier than it's ever been to live a double life, to live one way on the internet, one way in social media, another way at church. I just want to challenge you. If there's some of you this morning that are living in the dark, and you claim Christ is Lord, understand that God sees what you're doing right now. Understand that God knows what you're up to. I'm reminded of the story of Joseph. You remember Joseph? He's in Egypt. He's under Potiphar's rule. Potiphar's wife makes a pass at him. And what does he say? I couldn't do this. She's like, nobody's going to know. Nobody's going to see. What does he say? I couldn't do this and commit this great sin against God. There was this awareness that even in the privacy of that bedroom, God saw what was happening. Followers of Jesus, be careful that if you claim him as Lord, that your life is lived in submission to him. But there are others of us this morning that the struggle is not Jesus as Lord and disobedience and kind of rejecting or rebelling. Others of us struggle with shame. condemnation we feel for sin in our lives. One of my favorite Christian authors talks about the difference. He uses a metaphor, difference between two kids who wreck their dad's car. He says, on the one hand, a kid that wrecks his dad's car, there's some of us that think, oh my gosh, my dad's gonna kill me for wrecking my car. Can't call him, I gotta hide this. I gotta figure out a way to skirt this under the rug. But there's another type of kid that when he wrecks his dad's car says, man, the only person I can really call that's gonna help me is my dad. I gotta call my dad. My question to you very simply this morning is, which of those two postures is at work in your life with Jesus? When you sin, is your first posture fear? I gotta hide, I gotta conceal, I can never bring this to the light? Or is your first posture to say, I gotta call my dad? I gotta run into the arms of Jesus. No, Jesus, his grace and mercy isn't a license to sin, but let's be clear, when we do sin, we have a high priest who welcomes us into his arms. The judgment of God is real, but brothers and sisters, you are not under God's judgment and condemnation. You are under the free grace and mercy of Jesus. One of the reasons I'm so thankful for our church family is I really believe this is a place where you can be real and open and honest about your sin with other people. Why can we open up our lives and embrace vulnerability with others? Because we're under the grace, we're under the shade of God's grace that invites us to know him and to trust him. But the real thrust, though, of Acts 2 in this sermon here is not for believers, actually. Peter preaches this sermon not to those who had already trusted Christ. He preaches this sermon to those who had not yet placed their trust in him. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, I want to make this as plain as I can. You are under the judgment and wrath of God. Left to yourself, you will face a standard you cannot meet. Remember years ago, there was this serial killer that was caught, and he was so deranged, so arrogant that he rejected the public defender the court had assigned him, and he tried to defend himself. He was both defendant and attorney. And what he discovered, that's a bad idea, because even how you ask questions and how you cross-reference people, can cross-examine people, even that action can reveal things about your guilt and make you look more guilty. All of us enter the world like that. All of us enter the world in God's courtroom by ourselves, seeking to advocate for our own reasons as to why we're acceptable before God. When I was pastoring in Missouri, I got an urgent phone call one day. A member of our church asked me to come share the gospel with this man in the community. He was dying, he was on oxygen, he was having problems. I walked in the living room, I began to share the gospel with him, and as I was sharing and pleading with him to come to Christ, he held up his hand and he said, I really don't need God's grace. And I said, why? He said, years ago, I was walking across the dock at the lake. I saw these bubbles in the water. I saw somebody struggling. I jumped in the water and I saved this guy. And I know that because I saved him, God is going to accept me. I know that because I did this really good deed this one time, all of the bad that I've done has been wiped out. And I pleaded and I begged and I said, but what you're doing is you're assuming your standard is God's standard. You're assuming what you think is right is what God thinks is right. And if there's anything I could warn you of if you're not a Christian today, don't assume God is going to judge you based on what you think is right. Understand God is going to judge you based on what he thinks is right. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, what we hold out to you is that God is judge. The Spirit is here. Judgment's coming. But Jesus is Lord. He can save you. If you're not a follower of Jesus, in just a moment, I'm going to pray. I'm going to invite you to turn from your sin and trust Christ and Christ alone because he's Lord. As we pray and conclude this time, I'm also going to be praying for those of you that are believers to understand the assurance and the peace you have because Christ is Lord. Would you pray with me, please?